Alright, this is going to be a video response to the Scottish Socialist. Just before I went to work last time, I made a video called the USA versus USSR. That was a response to one of his videos. For a couple weeks there, he didn't reply, and I just figured, well, I made a really long video, and he doesn't want to be bothered with it, because I certainly know how that is. I've gotten 2-hour video responses unsolicited before, and that is annoying. Most of us don't really have the time, let alone the inclination, to reply to something like that. But just before I left work, he commented that, hey, he just noticed it, and he went ahead and prepared about a half-hour response that at the time I wasn't able to watch, because I'm not able to watch video while I'm at work. But I've been home a few days, so I took the time to go ahead and watch his response to mine. And this is a reply, and I'm not going to promise this is going to be shorter than my other video, but it should be. Just a few points of clarification that I kind of pointed out to him in the comments of his video. At one point he says that I'm a U.S. nationalist, and he doesn't say that because he's trying to strawman me or anything like that. He says that because at one point in my video I use phraseology that could definitely be interpreted as implying that. I said something to the effect of, I'm not making this argument against the USSR as a U.S. nationalist, which could mean that I am a U.S. nationalist and I'm simply not using that type of argumentation. But what I really meant by that is, if you make a video titled USSR versus USA, that is something that has very, very overt nationalist overtones, which was intentional. It's intentional to be that way, but it's ironic. I am not a nationalist to the extent, I mean, I'm an anarchist, basically. There's a lot of debate among people who believe as I do about the use of that term, but I don't think that there should be governments in the world. I don't think the United States should have a government, and I think that the vast majority of the bad things that happen in the United States society can be attributed to the government. Not all of them, but the vast majority. And I guess it is a point that could be debated whether one can be both an anarchist and a nationalist. There are people who actually self-identify as such. But even if we were to consider that, those would be a different type of nationalism than normally. Normally, nationalism means slavish obedience and fervor for a particular state, one's own state usually, and that's certainly not the case with me. Now, in terms of, and let me just be really explicit about where I am. Like I said, I'm an anarchist. I self-identify as an anarcho-capitalist, or an ANCAP. I'm definitely an Austro-libertarian, as in the American libertarian, which is the only kind in contemporary political lexicon, at least in the United States. I'm not sure how many leftists in Europe use the term libertarian. Perhaps there are some. I haven't met any or encountered any, but that certainly doesn't mean that they don't exist. When I say Austro-libertarian, that means that I am an advocate or proponent of the Austrian school of economics, which is not necessarily a libertarian philosophy, although there's a extremely high correlation between the two. Very few people who are Austrians are not libertarian, although there are exceptions. And my political philosophy is very much shaped by the thinker Murray Rothbard, the man who coined the term anarcho-capitalism. Both anarchy and capitalism are loaded, problematic terms, as are communism and socialism, and so there are lots of people who object or at least shy away from using those terms. However, I think that's unwarranted, because when I say that, anarcho-capitalism, they know what I mean. Even if there is ambiguity with the use of those words among the general populace, there isn't among the people who I am normally speaking to. So what I mean by capitalism is I believe in free markets. I believe that individuals, at least on utilitarian grounds, have a right to their bodies. They own their bodies. They own what they produce. Well, that they should be allowed to own private property and to exchange that private property, and that's what I believe. And the government is a negation of all that. The government is not a free market institution whatsoever. It's not based on free exchange. The guiding principle of most libertarian political thought is the so-called non-aggression principle, the idea being that self-defense is justifiable, but any other type of violence is not. And so, just as I cannot go to my neighbors and demand that they give me their property, their goods, their money, I can't go to the state and have them do that on my behalf. Basically, libertarian political philosophy is such that there is no double standard or hypocrisy allowed for the state or some other institution that is allowed to have more leeway or legal authority in terms of property acquisition than the average person. So I can't use eminent domain to take my neighbor's property, and just if I were to get the majority of my neighbors around me to vote to take this property, that wouldn't be all right either. So that's where I'm coming from. And I remember after I posted the response to it, I thought, well, I think he's a communist, but his YouTube username incorporates socialist, and you know, typically communism is considered to be a subset of socialism. Socialism is a broader term of which communism is a part, but there's antagonism between those groups. Sometimes there are self-identified communists who do not consider themselves socialist, and there's probably, although I haven't met any, socialists who consider communism somehow aberrant enough to not be deserving or included in the title. In one of your videos, Mr. Scottish Socialist, you talked about having taken basically a political quiz about how communist you are, and you vented your frustration that the questions are loaded or not very precise, and so the results are likewise not very precise. And as a libertarian, I have that same problem. But there are actually some really good tests geared towards libertarians, but I don't know if that can be said for communists or socialists. So let me go into, I'm not a nationalist, and the point of the video being titled the way it was in my kind of expose, and might I add, a totally incomplete expose of the problems with the USSR and the problems with the United States, which I was very keen on including in there, was not to kind of set up a celebrity death match between the two states. It was to analyze what's good and what's bad out of the two. I pointed out in that video, and I'd like to reiterate, that in social sciences it's very hard to use empiricism to validate or come up with social theory. So, I'm a free market capitalist. I think that everything should be based on profit and loss and mutual exchange and private property and individuals, and the government should have no role whatsoever. And I don't believe in democracy. I don't believe in socialism as it is almost always used. And you believe in socialism, you believe in democracy, you believe that some institution, whether it be a state or worker unions or have pretty sweeping powers, have communal ownership of the means of production, if not even more than that. And you and I can both just look at society, and there's so many variables that we can kind of cherry pick. So we can look at the USSR, and this is very, very common. Capitalist people like myself will look at the USSR and say, look at all these bad things, the gulags, the purges, the poverty, the low life expectancy, the just point to all these things and say, look, and they're socialist, hence socialism is bad. Or on the other hand, you can just as easily point to the USSR and say, oh, well, they don't have complete socialism. Stalin was a dictator. They had private property in X, Y, and Z. They didn't institute policy 1, 2, and 3. So the problems you're seeing, they shouldn't be attributed to socialism or communism. They should be attributed to these deviant features within the society. And then you can point to the United States and be like, oh, look, the United States has free markets and capitalism, and there's iniquity, and there's inequality, and there's a vast imperial empire, military industrial complex that's just going around the world, vaporizing people. And so doesn't that prove that capitalism and free markets are bad and greedy and counterproductive and hierarchical or whatever? And that's the trick with this, because we're both going to look and we're both going to see whatever we want to see, and so we're going to have to use a lot more discernment on each other's part to really do this. I think the first thing you need to have is a really coherent theory, something that really makes sense, and then you want to check that against the facts, and then you want to see as many facts as you possibly can, and what can you attribute to what. So if we look at the Soviet Union again, granted, it's not whatever your view of socialism is or communism. The Soviet Union probably never was exactly that. The truth of the matter is that every country in the world is a mixed economy. They have certain aspects of free market capitalism and certain aspects of socialism in every country. I don't know if I'll go into great detail here, but I consider governments to be explicitly socialist. They're not based on free exchange. They don't function the same way a company does, where people buy a service and they earn a profit. They are based on taxation. The rhetoric that is used to justify them is that of the common good, of the greater good, of the community, of whatever. In the past, most states use some kind of appeal to religion, either the divine right of kings, or maybe even the king was a deity of some type, as was the case in Pharaonic Egypt and many other societies. Since the at least the 18th century, this has been replaced by the democratic nation state, a state that is supposedly validated by the will of the people. However that is determined, which is usually actually a pretty tricky question, because that's a rather amorphous concept. What is the will of the people? Certainly the will of the people does not include the minorities who object to whatever it is the government's doing, which is everybody depending on the topic. I mean, there's nobody who agrees with everything the state is doing, and yet they are invoked as somehow legitimizing it by their existence, or their voting, or their failing to have moved. That's a really popular one. You didn't move, so you agree. That's all pretty nebulous logic, but all of it's collectivistic logic. All of it is an appeal to not free market principles, certainly, or individual sovereignty, but some greater collective whole that is either the government itself or is represented by the government. So all this is to say that even states that are pretty capitalistic, that have a lot of free markets, which I count the United States as being one of, they still have large elements of socialist functioning within them. And there's a lot of misconceptions about the United States, especially in Europe, basically to the effect that it is this radical free market society. This, if it was ever true, has become progressively less true since, at the very least, the progressive era in the 19 teens. 1913 is usually considered a very pivotal year in this process. It is true that in the 19th century, the U.S. federal government especially, this was never really true of the states individually, had a very, very limited role within society. It took a very small percentage of GDP, less than 1%, even during wartime, and had no, I mean, the average American, the federal government had nothing to do with them other than maybe the post office. They didn't get wages, they didn't get Social Security, didn't regulate hardly anything. Just made a few taxes on excise taxes, a few tariffs, and land sales, and that was it. This is not true anymore. It hasn't been true for 100 years. The federal government is an enormous aspect of society within the United States. You add up the state and local municipalities, and the aggregate of government is something in the 50% of the society range, and the 50% that it isn't government is regulated by the government. I was just hearing the other day that the U.S. government spends as much per capita on the health care of its citizens than as the U.K. does. So the U.K. has this National Health Service, and America, a lot of Europeans have told me this, well, in America, if you get sick, the government doesn't do anything, and the government just has a hands-off policy, which is just completely not true. The government is very much involved in healthcare, to our great detriment, I would add. So both aspects are present within either society. Now, if you look at the USSR, there's a lot less of the capitalism free market and a lot more of the socialism. Even if it's not a perfect socialist system, even if not everything there meets whatever your ideal is of how a socialist system should operate, there's a lot more of it there than there is in the United States. There's a lot in the United States. And there's some free market stuff in the Soviet Union. There's always, as far as I'm aware, black markets, and black markets are essentially free markets. The state has restricted them and persecuted them, but that's still people engaging in free exchange. They never actually abolished money in the Soviet Union, and although technically I think the state considered its prerogative to take anything, they did own all the capital goods, all the factories, but they didn't necessarily own everybody's home, every article of clothing. Every single physical piece of property wasn't actively being controlled by the state, even if rhetorically they like to think that they had that kind of power. And so, yeah, there are market mechanisms in the Soviet Union at any point. Doesn't matter, the 30s, the 40s, there's always some. So we've got to look and try and say, well, where's the bad stuff and where's the good stuff? So the games, like you said, you're a gamer. The gaming in the United States is not done by the government. It's not subsidized by the government. It's not really even regulated by the government very much. Certainly not funded by the government. It's made by for-profit companies engaging in voluntary transactions, voluntary exchange. They hire workers. The workers and the developers create a game, and then they go out and they try and sell it to consumers who are not obligated to subsidize them in any way. They don't have to pay taxes to provide salaries for these people. The only income that they have is to retail their product, whatever it may be, and lo and behold, some of them are successful enough at this that they can turn a profit and at the very least make a living, sometimes occasionally become wealthy. That's unusual, but it certainly does happen. And I just use gaming as an example, but we could be talking about any number of manufactured goods. And that's to the good. There's nothing, I don't see how one can view this as negative. We're talking about a series of bilateral exchanges that are voluntary. They're not coerced, except by the very, very dubious definition of coercion, which is if someone doesn't give it to you for free, or they only give it to you on the condition that you remunerate them with something, that's somehow coercion, which is, if that's coercion, then that's a different type of coercion than the type where you just rob somebody straight out with a gun. And there's an awful lot of that happens in the United States, within the United States, and that's spread around the world. And you admitted that if you had ever said the United States never produced anything good, that was hyperbole. And I wasn't sure, but I'm more than happy to take your word on that. But a lot of good things do come from the United States, and again, it's not just material goods. There's a lot of cultural aspects to this as well: music, art, philosophy, a lot of science, a lot of things that can't really be that can be attributed to the free market elements and can't really be attributed to the socialist elements. On the other hand, there's an awful lot of terrible things from the United States, which I think we both agree on largely. And I look at them and say it's the government. It's the government that does the war. It's the government that does the police state. It's a government that does all the mass arrests and has filled the prison system, which is sad to say, at least in some level comparable, at least in some aspects, to the Gulag system. And the government it's not a free market capitalist institution. I mean, if you want to say that it's not the ideal socialist system, fine, so be it. But it's based on taxation. It's based on collective ownership. The state is not owned by Barack Obama or by Goldman Sachs or by anyone. It's ambiguous property holder, more or less. Now, at one point, you said, well, the military, they serve the bourgeoisie classes, so they're not really socialist. I don't think that that's a fair way to look at it. Let's take the example of democracy. Democracy means you have an electorate, they vote, the majority, whatever gets the majority of votes, that becomes the policy. And so let's say we have an electorate and they vote, and this has happened. Let's say they vote to ban gay marriage. Say gay people can't be married. You might not like that result, and you might consider that bigoted or something else. But it's not an undemocratic decision because you don't like it. It was voted on. The electorate has spoken, and they spoke in a way that you didn't like, but that doesn't mean it's undemocratic. Likewise, you may not like what the state is doing, but that doesn't mean that the state is a free market enterprise. The state is most assuredly a socialist enterprise. It's funded by taxation. It has unilateral power. It is the state. It is not a company. It's not an individual. It has broad-reaching coercive powers, and if it's not engaged in activities that you approve of, that doesn't change that. Just like if a majority votes on something that you disapprove of, it doesn't mean that it's not democracy. And you can say you didn't like what Stalin did, which you have said, which kudos to you for doing that. There are socialists out there who will not do that still. But you can't say that it's not socialist. You can say it's not your brand of it, or that you wouldn't have done that in that situation, but it's not the same thing. And I also point out that I didn't simply take all the bad elements of the United States and then just call them socialist on my whim. I produced an article which you took the time to read by a democratic socialist who shared the same view. And that's a common view among socialists. They identify the state as a socialist institution within the society. If there is one, that's certainly it. And I mean, this is kind of a debate tactic the socialists actually use against mostly conservatives, because libertarians are a relatively small group. Because conservatives will say government's bad, government sucks, government's inefficient, so we shouldn't have government health care. But then conservatives love the military. And so savvy socialists, which there are not very many, I might add, will point out that, well, military is for common defense. It's funded. It's funded by the government. It's based on conscription. They don't currently conscript people in the United States, but they did for a long time. Although that was actually new. That was really introduced in a full-time way in 1940, but although I had precedent before that. And this is kind of, it shows the hypocrisy of conservative, because they're saying they're against socialism for healthcare, but they're not only not against, but they're in favor of socialism for militarism, for military, or for police, or for courts. And this is an argument that socialists use quite regularly if they're really savvy. And it's one that conservatives can't really wiggle out without looking like idiots or hypocrites, which is fine because that's what they typically are. But it doesn't work on me, because I don't think that we should have socialism in military spending, or defense, or anything for that matter. I don't think that it's valid to just say, well, it's not doing what I would do, so it's not socialist. It is socialist. If we look, going back to the USSR, addressing their abject poverty, you might say, well, hey, things weren't run the way that I wanted, but prices and private property were definitely abolished in capital goods and industry. Nobody could own a factory. You couldn't buy stock in a factory. You couldn't, that was abolished. So there were no prices. There was no market in capital goods, at the very least. People were buying and selling things like shoes and vodka, but not factories. And so if you don't have a pricing system in factories, it's just totally by fiat. It's whatever the government thinks is a good idea, and as it turns out, the government is incapable of making rational decisions in that area, even if they're very well intentioned, which sometimes they are, but their intentions don't translate into actual success. So the industrial output, the industrial technical abilities of the USSR were lagged far, far behind that of the United States, which again is not perfectly capitalistic, but you do have a fair amount of private property and markets in capital goods, in industry, and so they're much more competitive than they were in the USSR, and there's no other real explanation. I mean, people have kind of, like I said, there's lots of variables, and people say, oh, the United States has all these resources and blah, 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 but actually the USSR has more resources, and the USSR is in a society that's been established a lot longer than the United States. Not the USSR itself, but Tsarist Russia goes back several centuries to a point when there was nothing. There's literally nothing in the United States that is a capital good today. There were Indians out here, but none of their technology or capital has been retained. It's all been eroded or destroyed and replaced by new things. So there's that. Now, another thing is, you kind of said, well, you like democracy. Democracy is a good idea. And I just don't think that we can take this as axiomatic. It'd be kind of like me saying, well, that sounds nice, but it's uncapitalist, and so anything that's capitalist is inherently correct. I think you would expect me to qualify that somehow, as to, well, explain why exactly something needs to be capitalist to be correct. This is something I just hear from socialists ad nauseum. They'll just dismiss an argument or dismiss a position and say, well, that's undemocratic. What is the basis for assuming that democracy is moral? Not that I'm a huge moralist, but given the amount of sermonizing that we get from Democrats, I think that's a pretty valid question. And B, is utilitarian. In a democracy, and really the same problems arise whether we're talking about direct democracy or representative democracy. They have the same problems. They manifest slightly differently. There's slightly different incentives, but they have the same problems. Either way, majorities can run roughshod over minorities. I think it's a misnomer to think that you're empowered and you have a say if you're consistently being basically outvoted by somebody else. The majority gets what they want, the minority get nothing, or they get whatever it is the majority is dictating to them. And I think it's kind of silly to then pretend like that minority is somehow empowered by that. If you live, and this, I'll use an example of electoral politics, but we could be talking about policies just as easily. If you live in a district that is safely in the other political party, so in the United States, if you're a Democrat but you live in a, quote, red state, in an area that's primarily Republican, then your political whims and desires are completely not represented by government at your level. And likewise, if you're in the UK and you're, say, liberal and you live in an area that's consistently conservative, the fact that you're voting is just basically like a kabuki dance. It's not exercising any political power at all, and it's kind of a joke to pretend that your electoral activity means that you have actual political power. And I'm using the example of representative democracy here, but it could be policy-wise. So if we had direct democracy and I live in an area where most of the people are factory workers and they want to vote to favor the factory, and I'm an agriculturalist, uh, you know, it doesn't matter what I think because the majority is against me. Now, the other thing is there are moral questions about that. Just because something's a majority doesn't make it right. The majority of an electorate can be demonstrably wrong if they're voting on scientific issues. They can be morally questionable, say if they vote to go to war, something that democracies have been extremely willing and able to do. In representative democracies, it's very rarely put directly to the people, but in some democracies in the past, it has been. In ancient Athens, this was certainly the case, and they had no qualms about voting to go to war. And in representative democracies, it's quite common to elect people who that's their position. The re-election of George Bush, for instance, in 2006, I'm sorry, 2004, there was no question that that was a mandate to many people about whether the war should continue or not, and he won that election. Does that mean that the war in Iraq and Afghanistan was justified? Absolutely not. Just because he got a majority of the votes relative to Kerry doesn't prove anything in that regard. So I don't think there's any basis for just assuming that if a majority votes for something, it's A, moral, or B, a good idea. There are other problems. There's rational ignorance. If we live in a society where the number of things that we vote on is relatively expansive, and this is something I think most socialists are kind of hoping for. They're saying, I want there to be I don't want there just to be elections for president. I want there to be elections for, how the factories are run, how the farms are run, how everything is manufactured. The potential scope is basically unlimited, and it's never explicit. I don't know any socialists who say, look, socialism has power to do this, and that's it. There's no minarchist socialists. And this means that the electorate is going to be voting on everything, and quite frankly, not everyone is qualified to vote on everything. Now, I'm not saying that we need to have an oligarchy where there's a group of smart people who run everything, because nobody is that smart. Nobody is able to run the rest of society, but people are able to run their own lives, their own things, the own areas where they specialize, and their input should be more relevant than that of others. It doesn't make any sense for you to spend a lot of time learning about or mastering what would be required of you to make informed decisions on topics where your vote is going to count for almost nothing. And so the basic fact is that you can either be counted on to just vote what feels good, which is never a sound basis for policy, or you can just vote to satisfy whatever biases you may have, which also is not a good policy, or you can be swayed by a silver-tongued demagogue. And this is a major danger with democracy that for some reason most Democrats and Socialists seem to totally discount. But historically, whenever there have been electorates, whether they be direct or otherwise, you develop political leadership. Somebody, even if it's not an elected office, who is able to sway certain numbers of voters, and it depends on the scale of the voting block. If we're talking about a factory with 100 workers, someone could, as easily as control 10, 15% of the vote. If we're talking about larger areas, and we could be talking about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of voters. And the simple fact is that these people have more electoral power than those who lack such influence. And there's no way to really curtail this. There's nothing you can do that says, okay, you're not allowed to have influence on other people, because that's, how is that enforceable even with complete tyranny? I don't think that would be a feasible solution. So it's a myth to kind of think everyone has an equal say when you know that people who are adept at manipulating, or at the very least persuading others, are going to have more power. And this incentivizes them to abuse that power. And given the fact that the electorate is not going to have time, most of them, and most issues, to really be well informed, they are going to tend to defer decision making to this elect group. And this is how you get a Joseph Stalin, essentially. It's going to devolve to where a few people are going to exercise political power, and the voting process is little more than a rubber stamp legitimizing that power. That this is what democracy, whether it be representative or direct, boils down to historically every single time. Even the so-called benign states like Sweden or whatever, they have political powers in them. They have politicians in there who are powerful, who have influence over the state bureaucracy far in excess of their single vote, far more than the average voter, who is supposedly the basis of the entire process. And there's no getting around this, and there's extreme moral hazard involved. So there are innumerable other problems with democracy. The gerrymandering problem, for one. How do you decide what the electorate is going to be? Because the makeup of the electorate is going to, before the fact, strongly influence, if not completely decide, the outcome of the elections. You can't have a democratic decision on this because that's the very topic that's being discussed. You can't have a vote on where the voting line should be, because if we disagree, I mean, if there's unanimity, it's not a problem, but if there's any disagreement, then who even gets to vote in the decision to decide is ambiguous. And what would need to happen is you'd have to have some kind of leader who is just going to arbitrarily say, I don't care what you think, this is what the electorate is going to be. And of course then that person is the de facto ruler of the society. And I mean, usually the usual answers I get to this problem are, well, we'll just have we'll just have electorates that are based on the naturally occurring political units, but there are no naturally occurring political units, and even areas that seem likely to be suggestive of a political unit, they have people on the margins. So you could say Brooklyn, but what about the people who live on the border between Brooklyn and the adjacent boroughs? Isn't there some question there? You can't decide that democratically. You have to decide that authoritarianly. It's not a word, but you get my drift. So there's also a question of how effective democracy is. It's very time-consuming to vote on everything. We're not going to have any time producing or working. We're going to spend all our time electing. And I find it very odd that this is considered so obviously correct. There's no basis for coming to this conclusion. I think that individual sovereignty is a much more empowering idea. So you can be poor, you can be stupid, you can have low skill, have a bad job or even no job, but if you have a right to your life and a life to your property, then you can tell all the rest of the people in the world to fuck off and get off your land. And of course, if in a free market, there's no taxes that are going to eventually push you off your land, which is certainly not the case now, when there are taxes that make people homeless. I think that's more empowering than saying that you get a 1/1,000,000th vote in issues that are going to be controlled by some bureaucracy, some politician, some political leader. And I mean, there's a lot of flowery rhetoric. People are wrapped up emotionally in the term, but I just don't think that's justified. And even if it is, I mean, it needs to be defended. It can't just be taken for granted that having voting take place makes it okay. It just doesn't. So I do realize that this video has not made a comprehensive attempt to argue for free market capitalism, my expressed position. I have many videos along those topics, mostly approaching it from the position of there are common fears about free market society, for instance, that free markets will lead to monopolies, will lead to the oppression of workers or low wages, and each one of those are interesting topics that deserve elaboration. And one thing you'll notice about my videos and their length is I'm very keen on elaboration, and I've already done that in so many videos. So if anyone watches this and is curious as people ask me from time to time, what about this or that topic, chances are I've already addressed it. And if you don't want to navigate the huge number of videos I have, you can ask, and if I can remember, I will direct you to them. But I think that it's really important. The whole point of having the USA versus the USSR was not to get in a dick measuring contest between the two. It was to try and analyze where are the good parts of the society, where are the bad. And we find that the capitalist, in the sense of free market aspects of the United States, are quite positive. The socialist aspects of the United States are the source. Maybe it's the mutant socialism, but it's certainly not the free market sector of the vast majority of the evil. If you look at the USSR, it may not have been the perfect ideal concept of socialism that you or others entertain, but they successfully abolished private property in many important areas in money, which of course is the case in the United States. There's no private property in money. The government has complete socialist control over the printing of money, which is a huge disaster. That's a whole other topic. And there's not really anything laudatory that we can ascribe to the socialism in the USSR. You can call it a workers' paradise all you want, but the fact is, the standard of living in the USSR was abysmal by any Western standards, not just that of the United States. The excuses as to why don't work. Someone was commenting on my other video, well, they really had it rough in World War II. That's absolutely true, they did. But so did Germany, so did Japan, so did the rest of Western Europe, and yet within just a few years after the war, all those societies were doing much, much better. Germany was bombed into the Stone Age, literally. All their infrastructure was destroyed. About 5% of their population died. Probably double that was maimed. Massive amounts of rape. All the cities were turned to rubble. All the factories were turned to piles of smoking ash. And they were forced to pay reparations, and huge parts of their entire political system was destroyed, and yet within 10 years they had a much higher standard of living than they'd had before. Whereas the Soviet Union was still, in serfdom, basically. And there's no question that the Soviet Union suffered horrendously during the World War II, but their entire industrial base was not destroyed. The Nazis never penetrated the Urals. They never were even able to bomb into the Urals, let alone the rest of Eurasia. And the Russians received ample support from the United States via Lend-Lease, and yet by the 1980s they still don't even have toilet paper. So something's clearly, yes, the war carnage is terrible, there's no question about that, but there's something else wrong with that society other than World War II, which really, the Soviet Union, if you ask them, the best thing that ever happened in the Soviet Union was World War II, because war is the health of the state. And that's no different for the United States than it is for the USSR. War is very good for the state. Who knows what would have happened to Stalin if he hadn't been saved by Hitler? I know that sounds weird, but he's running out of people to coup d'etat, and that may actually be what eventually happened to him. There are those who think that he was actually assassinated because he was about to liquidate a whole bunch of other people, and some of those potential victims decided they'd rather not go that route. I'm not saying that happened, but there are allegations to that effect. So, Jesus Christ, I'm such a liar. This isn't as long as the previous video, but it is long. I do appreciate the response. I think that we're being very civil, and that's pretty unusual, and that's cool. I do feel like we're probably going to be talking past each other just a little bit. It's kind of inevitable when we have such different worldviews and different perspectives on things. So, take that for what it's worth. It's not a dismissal of any potential understanding that's exchanged between us, but I'm just being a little pragmatic here, maybe a little jaded. But yeah, I'm definitely not a nationalist. I do believe in American exceptionalism, but I don't think that that's because there's something intrinsic about America. I think the circumstances allowed for there to be a lot less political control in the United States than was the case in Europe. And so there was a great flowering of society and civilization here, an unprecedented flowering of it, really. But I think that ideas from Europe have become ascendant, and that many of the really good aspects of American society have become considered anachronistic, unreasonably so, I'd say. And you know, we're not too different really from most other Western European countries at this point. There are some important differences, but not many. And so one has to be has to use a lot of discernment when one is trying to assess, you know, what's good and what's bad. But I think if you look at it closely, the idea that, you know, socialism is this, if not a panacea, at least a viable solution, whereas free market capitalism is a bane on society, is not a description of the world that comports very much with reality. But you know, you probably disagree, but that's my point. So, cheers.